And so I just want to say that I worked on this presentation with Dr. Isaac Rutenberg, who is a JD Law and PhD in chemistry, who works in my team. And I think what's really critical is, as we know, as people who work at that interface of AI and digitalization, but who may not be programmers and AI experts, it's really critical to think about what are the governance frameworks that we need to look at? How do we look at the ethics of this space? And so it's really critical to bring as much of a multidisciplinary view to this kind of work. So one of the things that's really critical around this work for me is really being an African woman and having lived in Canada and North America for a long time. It's really, how do I bring the interfaces of the knowledge of my ancestors to the knowledge I learned through my PhD, for the work I've done at the interface of the bioscience, digitalization, and AI. And I used to head a think tank in Montreal, Canada, at the interface of sustainability and digitalization. And so one of the things that's really critical is, how do we really look at our collective knowledge systems in ways that really allow us to harness not only our collective intelligence, but also the planetary wisdom that is needed for us to move effectively forward in this space. And so the idea of building AI for good systems is really about the integration in partnership in a participatory way of how we look at traditional indigenous knowledge and AI systems in a way that really ensures that we're respecting the dignity of human beings, of nature, the dignity and data sovereignty of local and indigenous populations, and that we ensure that there's mutual benefit in how we're all collectively working together. So this presentation really explores the challenges of how we look at this and the opportunities. And so first, I wanted to give you a sense of who are we in terms of CIFOR-ICRAF. So my organization has about 25 offices around the world. We're present in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We also have offices in Germany. And it's really critical that the work we do is really about, how do we look at science in local context? So it's really about place-based work. And the critical importance of that is, whether we're looking at the work we're doing in Vietnam, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Brazil, it's really, how are we working with local communities, with policymakers, local stakeholders, the local value chains, to advance the kind of work that is of interest to us, that's at the interface of forestry, agroforestry, biodiversity, food security, and climate. And all looking at, how do we improve local livelihoods and while benefiting nature and making the world more climate resilient. So let me just make sure. I'm not sure. Okay. Okay. Okay, so CIFOR-ICRAF, I'm sure none of you have ever heard of this, and so, we're a hidden treasure. We have two headquarters, one in Bogor, Indonesia, and Nairobi, Kenya. I'm based in Nairobi, Kenya. And so we work at harnessing the power of trees, forests, and agroforestry landscapes to address biodiversity, climate, food, livelihoods, and equity. And so the work we do is really focused in these three areas: biodiversity, climate, and food security. And what we see is that that interface is really critical in terms of the work we do can help really deal with the inequality affecting women and indigenous people and other marginalized groups, and that the work we do can look at, how do we go from unsustainable supply chains to sustainable and virtuous supply chains that bend the curve on the loss of biodiversity and the loss of forests, while at the same time looking at, how do we have food systems that are regenerative and they're not depleting nature. And so, with over 40 years plus of research and development work across the world, we've accumulated a lot of data sets that demonstrate that trees' potential to transform these challenges into opportunities. And so the first challenge that is really critical to us is safeguarding biodiversity. We know that over 50% of the world's tropical forests have been destroyed, and on average, 137 species are driven to extinction in tropical rainforests every day. And we also know that 27% of assessed species are threatened with extinction. So I had the honor of meeting Nobel laureate Wangari Maathai when she was alive. And this is one of the quotes that I love from her. It's the little things citizens do that make the difference. My little thing is planting trees. So Wangari Maathai, before, inspired not only Kenyan women, but everybody around the world towards what we now have, which is a trillion tree agenda. And so the second challenge we look at is stabilizing our climate. We know that the global temperature is predicted to rise 3 degrees by the end of the century. And in some places in the world, it's really the difference between a livable place or not. We also know that when you have trees, you can cool areas down to 10 degrees. So we know that trees can play a very critical role in these spaces. 20% of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions are from forestry, agriculture, and other land uses. So we know we can improve land use in many ways to ensure we do all we can to not reach that 3 degrees. We also know that peatlands are the largest natural carbon store and hold 25% of global soil carbon, twice the world's forests. And so how we preserve the peatlands, how we understand the data related to the restoration and preservation of peatlands, and also the stewardship needed by local communities to preserve these peatlands is really important. And so I really like this quote from Warren Buffett. Someone's sitting in the shade today because someone planted a tree a long time ago. And so the work we do isn't about tomorrow. It's about the next decade, the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so I really love the notion of how do we look at 7 generations, whether we're looking at 3 behind us, 3 forward and us, or 7 generations ahead. But we know we need to do this work in terms of stabilizing our climate. And so how do we do this, and how can this be accelerated within the AI age? Third challenge is we live in a world where close to 900 million people go to bed hungry every day. We know 11% of people are undernourished, but we also know that 30% of food is lost or wasted, while we have 3 billion people who are food insecure in the world. So how can this digital age we're in help us match food availability and the need for nourishment for everyone? We also know that 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions result from food production, but we also know that we can produce food in ways that are nature positive and that actually are net zero or even negative in terms of helping sequester carbon. So transforming food systems is the third challenge that is really critical to the work we do at CIFOR-ICRAF. So again, I'm here to talk about that interface with AI. And so I'm going to be talking about a project that we've been completing that is in partnership with a group led through one colleague here at University of Hawaii, Jason Lee, and another colleague in Montreal, Jason Lewis. And they've been leading this program called Abundant Intelligence. And it builds on the Indigenous AI protocol. And it's really about how do we look at the interface of artificial intelligence, traditional indigenous knowledge, and in our particular case, the case study we wanted to look at was fire. And so what's really critical here is to realize that the work we do is really about how do we bring out these different knowledge systems together in a way where we're not promoting power dynamics, but we're really living our interconnectedness. And so what we know is that AI systems in science can have strengths that allow us large-scale data processing, predictive models, and we can have applications that are relevant to climate monitoring, food systems, disaster responses. But we also know that they have limitations. We know that there are biases, there's opacity, and dependency on incomplete data. So if we're looking at these AI systems and data and information, we know how critical bad data in, bad insights out. So really, high quality data has to be the foundation of any work in this space. And so at CIFOR-ICRAF, we're building robust and important data sets. And we've been doing this for decades. And so I'm going to talk about some of these data sets, not all of them. We have about 120 digital tools through CIFOR-ICRAF. And so one of these tools is the Land Degradation Surveillance Framework. And it's a data-driven network to assess and monitor soil health, land degradation, and vegetation dynamics. We happen to have the largest samples of tropical soils around the world. And so this data that's been gathered through decades, compiled as well on the ground in terms of ground truthing, but also monitoring of satellite data, has really consistently been applied through across many projects. And for each site, we usually have in sites over 250 to 100 square kilometer sites. And so we assess multiple biophysical indicators that enable statistical comparisons across land use, and we can do predictive maps around how different practices can determine different outcomes. And parallel to LDSF, we also have another platform that was developed in our team in Indonesia called Lumens for land use planning for multiple environmental services. And this one specifically was developed to empower multi-stakeholder negotiations for planning sustainable landscapes that can support livelihoods and development while maintaining and restoring environmental services. And so what it allows is it allows users to plan different scenarios and look at what those predictive outcomes can look like. So we've been building, using machine learning predictive models to look at land and how do we look at land health in the future. We know that there's 2 billion hectares of degraded land around the world. And ideally, we want to restore all of those by 2030. So is it possible? We also have a tool called Tree Grower, which is a tree globally observed environmental ranges database. And in this database, we cover over 48,000 out of the around 66,000 tree species around the world, because we are mostly focused on the tropics. And we look at 51 variables. And so this data combined to what we also do in terms of tree ring analysis in terms of dendrochronology, and it's how we're looking at how trees live stress over time, allows us to do predictive analysis of what will be growing where in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, given climate change. And so what should we be planting in cities and rural areas, on farm, knowing that we have to deal with climate change is really critical. And building on these platforms, we've created the Regreening Africa app that's already reached 600,000 farmers in Africa. And it's a participatory platform that allows smallholder farmers to input what they're growing on their field, how it's growing, and for our scientists to combine the satellite and ground truthing data together to really look at how do we harness citizen science as well as researchers to really be doing participatory work together. And so what is really wonderful about this is we just finished phase one where we reached 600,000 farmers. And we launched at the Land COP in December 2024, phase 2, which is a 20 million euro project with the European Commission, looking at how do we go from reaching 600,000 farmers to at least doubling that. And so far, we've helped restore 350,000 square kilometers of land. And our intent is how do we go to tripling that in the next 5 years. So what we do is really about the critical importance of how are we looking at uploading data, looking at how citizens are uploading data, combining a dashboard that includes the research and data that we do as well as citizens, and being able to look at how are they using it, how are we able to have this data help farmers plan in the future, and how can we help use this data to unlock financing for farmers across Africa for biodiversity preservation, climate resilience, better food security. As all of you know, trees can produce shade, produce food, medicine, energy, and these multiple uses are critical in terms of how we harness the power of trees for climate resilience and biodiversity preservation. So we really see citizen science as really critical to the partnership of the work we do as researchers. And so what we see is really important is how we look at our work and have it be rooted in land, water, fire, atmosphere, and biodiversity is really critical to what are the practices that are passed down across generations and often in local languages and not always written. And how do we bring that together into platforms that are interactive, that can allow us to really have actionable insights for the future? So examples are looking at seasonal calendars. What we know is we can help farmers plan so that across seasons, they are producing food that gives them adequate nutrition year long. You know, it's very interesting. There are like some trees that particularly in the dry seasons lose their leaves and that are nitrogen fixing, so increase the fertility of soil. So how do you combine that? How do you ensure that you have the right amount of protein, knowing what crops are being grown, what livestock people have available, as well as the seasonality of seeds and nuts and fruit production on trees? And so this is really where the type of work we do, data-driven, is really important. We also know the critical importance of, if we're going to be able to work in terms of traditional and indigenous knowledge, we need to be grounded in principles of reciprocity, governance, and adaptation, so that management as well as coexistence are embedded in how we work collectively together. We also know that every year, wildfires and fires that are caused by man-made actions are accelerating. We know that approximately 340 to 370 million hectares, more than the size of India, burns each year. The recent Los Angeles fires alone, cost over $100 billion. We know that landscape fire smoke is estimated to cost over 339 million deaths annually, 157,000 in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's why people don't know that most of the deaths are in Africa, 110,000 in Southeast Asia. We know that many of these fires could be prevented if we really look at land use planning and looking at the presence of indigenous trees in our landscapes, and also how we look at science, and in Canada we call it two-eyed seeing, and the idea of how do we integrate traditional indigenous fire management principles in how we do work. So integrated fire management takes a holistic approach that really looks at both fire as both an ecological necessity and a hazard. And so intentional burning practices that are well-timed, really have ecological tools, can be key in terms of preventing the spread of fires that are really devastating. But at the same time, for example, in Canada, the wisdom related to integrated fire management was punished by death up to 1860. And so this wisdom is a wisdom that was seen as dangerous for a very long time. So how we make it safe, how we look at integrating it in a way that honors the peoples who used it for millennia, and how we do it in a way that also is trauma sensitive, is really critical to how do we bring all of this data and this knowledge together in this AI age. So this is really critical to how we're looking at prediction, risk mapping, fire detection, resource allocation, and combining systems for adaptive fire management. So integrating AI and traditional indigenous knowledge is really the crux of the work we've been doing with abundant intelligence over the last year. And what's really critical for me is really that what the work we've done so far has really looked at how those three systems, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, fire management, artificial intelligence, separately, but looking at how do we look at that integration together is really key to what we can do moving forward to ensure we have better management of fires in the future. And so as an example, ASU has been holding a conference on Native American AI developers recently, looking at this particular interface. So there are things happening around the world, but as long as these efforts are fragmented and we're not learning from each other, we can't accelerate how we use them to ensure we're managing fire in the best way possible in the future. So this is a really critical element of how we move forward. So why integrate AI and traditional indigenous knowledge? Well, traditional indigenous knowledge adds local context missing in AI models. I was in Redmond, Washington, just a few days ago for the Microsoft Innovation Summit, and here I was with, like the chief technology officer of Microsoft, quantum computing experts, and what they were saying was, look, AI is only as good as partnering with domain experts. If the partnering with domain experts isn't happening, the data that is being used is not grounded in the place and people who need to know what insights that we can get out of data. So this is where we really have to elevate the critical importance of traditional indigenous knowledge systems. And so what we see as AI strengthens reach and visibility of traditional indigenous knowledge practices if we really allow domain experts and AI experts to be working hand in hand in a way that's equitable. And that integration has to foster innovation and inclusivity. So the hypothesis is that AI systems will be better contextualized and holders of traditional indigenous knowledge will better adapt to climate change. So how can we do this integration? So we need to look at ethical considerations, respect and data sovereignty, prior informed consent is really important, full disclosure and mutual understanding, mutual benefit and equitable sharing has to be foundational, and we need to avoid at all costs extractive practices. Because we're also looking at bringing people who've had wounds, who've had intergenerational trauma, and who've had issues of trust in the past. And we know that impact happens at the speed of trust. So it's not all about the science. It's about what is that foundation of trust we're creating so science can be harnessed for good. And so great care is required. And even when the project is framed, should avoid unintended messaging. So example, if you talk about integrating traditional indigenous knowledge into AI systems, you're giving more power and you're creating a hierarchy between AI and traditional indigenous knowledge. So similar, treating traditional indigenous knowledge as just another data source is taking away the cultural, historical, intergenerational dimensions of what that represents. And so how we frame this is really, really important. Okay, let me sure I'm getting into the right direction. Yes. So integrated fire management, we know that there's challenges in terms of data bias, the quality of data, compute power, indigenous sovereignty. Each of these should be addressed. We need to understand what are those limitations and how do we address them. We can look at how to enhance fire prediction using satellite weather and tree ring data. This is the dendrochronology data around tree stress and knowing what's going to be growing in the future given climate change. We also know that machine learning optimizes detection and resource allocation. But remember, this all has to be grounded in the trusted space that needs to be created to work effectively together. So I wanted to share this quote, which is, Indigenous peoples' knowledge of and reliance on fire is grounded in understandings involving specific relationships between humans, plants, and animals, including traditional governance practices and laws that have been developed, adapted, and passed down through generations. So this work by Kara Hoffman, Amy Cardinal Christensen, and others is really critical to how do we look at a seasonal calendar that illustrates aspects of Indigenous fire stewardship. And again, it's really critical to understand this has to be with prior informed consent, and that prior informed consent has to be continuously updated to ensure that the work that's being done is grounded in equity, in a continuous reassertion of the prior informed consent. Okay. Okay. So we know that Indigenous fire stewardship has managed landscapes for millennia. So cultural burning in Australia reduces wildfire intensity. So I had the opportunity to be in Australia last year in October and was able to go into the Blue Mountains and compare, look at the lands where the terrible fires happened a few years ago in Australia and look at the places where there had been Indigenous fire management using Indigenous wisdom and where it hadn't. And it was really clear. The difference was striking in terms of what we were able to see. A group of us that had come from all over the world for the Nature Positive Summit to learn from what was being done in Australia to look at the integration of Indigenous fire management wisdom into policies and applications of fire management. We also know that This stewardship provides tested place-based knowledge to mitigate wildfire risks. Yet, those proven methods are often sidelined in contemporary policies. We also know that with climate change, it's not only those dry areas, but areas that were more humid are facing fires. And so that wisdom may not be in those communities. So also, how do we look at the sharing of communities from dry lands that were used to fires and had fire management in their millennial knowledge systems to places that had never seen it? And so this is why, for me, there's an urgency around how do we share across global north, global south, across different areas, arid areas and humid areas. Wherever you are on the planet, you're being affected. You can be in a place where there's millennia of knowledge around it, and you can be in places where climate change has accelerated change so much that the knowledge that's held by other wisdom keepers elsewhere could be useful to you. So again, how do we create trusted spaces to share this knowledge? We know that use of AI to better integrate Indigenous terminology and knowledge into contemporary fire managed systems is something that's happening. It's happening in Australia, it's happening in Brazil. So the goal of the work we're doing is really how do we bridge Indigenous fire knowledge, AI technology, and sustainable finance? Because at the end of the day, what we want is local communities to be the stewards, to be the ones who are invested in, to ensure that local land is restored to health and is as resilient as possible to climate change, to fire. And we need to create innovative, culturally sensitive solutions for a fire resilient future. And so engaging with Indigenous networks that are involved in fire management is very important. And facilitating global North-South dialogue on Indigenous knowledge is really important. And so the work we've been doing, like I said, has been supported by the Abundant Intelligence Group at Concordia University in Canada. And it's really critical about how are we working together. And the only reason I was able to be a collaborator on this, it's because I spent years while I was still in Canada building trust with Indigenous knowledge holders, Indigenous researchers, because it can take a long time to build the trust. But if we don't do it, we'll never get to the place where we're actually working together. So these are really critical elements we really need to think about. And I also just one of the things I wanted to say is I just came back from Vancouver, where I was at the University of British Columbia. And what I love about what's happening there is that they have a research center that brings on fire resilience, that is bringing Indigenous knowledge and the sciences of the Faculty of Forestry, GIS, together to look at how do we look at a science and Indigenous knowledge-driven way forward, and also how do we talk to communities? How do we ensure that we're not just working on the research and development side, that we're going out there, talking to communities, talking to policymakers, talking to all stakeholders to look at how we collectively work together. And so what's also very exciting for me is how do we share best practices, whether it's what's happening in British Columbia, whether it's what's happening in Pará, Brazil, or in Bogor, Indonesia. And so there's an opportunity, particularly in this age of AI, to allow knowledge flow to really accelerate how we harness planetary intelligence. And again, the aim is how do we ensure that sustainable finance for fire management on Indigenous managed land is prioritized? How do we look at how can this help unlock long-term funding to scale resilient strategies? How do we look at region-centric knowledge system built on existing forestry and fire research ecosystems? That's why I'm so excited to be here in Hawaii, to look at what is happening here at University of Hawaii. How are you working with policymakers, local communities? How are you looking at the devastating fires that have happened in the recent years? And how can we collectively learn from what you've been through and what you're imagining for the future? And this is also why the work of Abundant Intelligence is so exciting to me, because it's also linked to the Indigenous Futures Center that's led at the University of Concordia, because it comes down to what is the future we collectively want to imagine, and how do we work together to reverse engineer it? So when we can do that, we really can get financial tools that require clearly defined concepts and terminology, including traditional indigenous knowledge. Imagine if all our bankers' investment portfolios had integrated traditional indigenous knowledge and how they're evaluating portfolios. Imagine where models like green bonds and carbon finance can support indigenous-led efforts. And so one of the exciting partners that we've had the pleasure of working with is the RAD network. And their values are about upholding the knowledge of elders and knowledge keepers, grounding their work in spirit and ceremony, being guided by the 7 ancestral grandfather and grandmother teachings of love, respect, bravery, truth, honesty, humility, and wisdom, prioritizing integrity, centering indigenous languages, worldviews, and guiding principles, honoring cultural and kinship ties, and developing relationships rooted in reciprocity and respect, and working in ethical spaces. So what I think is really important is our work with the RAD network here really aligns with their goals of advancing indigenous rights and responsibilities, care for lands, waters, biodiversity, and climate through the establishment of indigenous people's centers and areas that we have indigenous-led nature-based solutions, where you share knowledge and tools and expertise among indigenous nations on how to implement nature-based solutions in their territories and build regenerative economies. How do we collectively influence policy locally, globally, multilaterally? So from our local towns and areas to the UN multilateral system, and really allow legislation to enable centering indigenous jurisdictions and inherent rights and responsibility in nature-based solutions, including carbon and other natural assets? How do we create new pathways, financial pathways, and equitable funding that connect nations and indigenous organizations to financial resources through ethical, reciprocal relationships with funders and investors, including the creation of standards and protocols that center indigenous rights? And how do we connect youth to active programs in indigenous-led nature-based solutions to provide an opportunity to contribute and grow skills? So moving toward good AI really requires guiding principles of dignity, transparency, and accountability. And we need participatory governance where grievance mechanisms ensure restorative justice. We also need to build trust through co-creation. And this is where it's really critical to look at how do we look at those boundary framing platforms that allow us to be able to not only look at how are we programmed, but what are the guardrails that are ensuring we're really embedding an ethical way forward in how we're working. So we have challenges and opportunities, of course. We have interoperability issues, we have data quality issues. We need to look at the legal gaps, recognizing the importance of traditional indigenous knowledge. The opportunities are how do we innovate collectively from a technical, social, and economic and financial point of view? How do we help scale the community empowerment so that beyond integrated fire management, instead of losing the size of Indian forest every year, how do we scale food security and agroecology that will help us have more resilient landscapes to fire? How do we bring biodiversity monitoring and conservation finance to use high quality data? And how do we look at water resource governance with the stewardship of indigenous and local people? And so what we've learned is that there's a complementarity where community cues can enrich AI data, but risks are oversimplification. We need to take the needed time to build trust and to ensure that cultural context is respected. We also know that safeguards are really critical, and this is where participatory design is so important. And I've had the opportunity to interact with the tech world, and what they say themselves is the major mistake they make is not bringing the communities in when they start thinking about these types of projects. So continuous feedback from start, from ideation, is really critical in terms of how we work together. So in conclusion, so what we know is that AI and traditional indigenous knowledge integration can support a pathway to good AI. We know that integrated fire management can be a proof of concept for broader application. And what we need to do is build systems that respect knowledge, protect dignity, and deliver resilience. So I'd like to thank the Abundant Intelligence Project at Concordia University that was supported by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which is a federally funded research agency that promotes research and training in humanities and social science for the support for this work. And I thank you all for taking the time in your day to be here. I know you're not getting this hour back, so I'm really grateful that you've shared it with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eliane, for the time, the experiences, and the knowledge you've shared with us. We truly appreciate it. So at this time, we'd like to open the floor for questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone over to you. Okay.
Sorry. You talked a lot about the questions that you have to ask and, you know, holding space for the time that it takes to create relationships. But we also see that there is the rapid increase of fires and things of that nature. What kind of solutions are you, working towards to kind of bridge that gap of, you know, maybe the environment not having the time that it takes to be able to create the relationships and so forth? Sorry.
A really good question. So part of it is we know that there are amazing efforts happening all over the world, but in many cases, they don't know each other. So one of the reasons why, even though when the abundant intelligence proposal was being prepared, it took 2 years to prepare, and I was in Montreal, and I supported the preparation of that phase. When the funding came in, I got a job that required, I moved from Montreal, where I was a professor and associate professor in the Department of Geography at Concordia and a professor of practice at McGill University, to Nairobi. And so for the principal investigators, they're like, look, Eliane, you're moving, but we want you to stay on this. We're going to figure out how we keep you affiliated because it's urgent that the sharing of knowledge across the global south and global north gets accelerated. It's important that the fragmentation we see around the world turns into communities of practice. And this is the amazing part of the digital world we're in, is you can go from 0 followers today to 1 million next week. Hopefully it's not just Taylor Swift, but it's the rest of us that are able to harness the power of the digital age to help solve these critical issues. And so how do we create the advocacy work? How do we partner with the arts to spread the message beyond ourselves to connect to other places in the world is really critical. So this is why accelerating the speed of trust by looking at how we stop the fragmentation and we increase the connectivity of all these groups doing great work around the world is so urgently needed. And so that's why for me, like I flew 26 hours to Montreal, another 6 to Seattle, another 5 here. It's important for me to be here. People are like, why are you traveling this much? Because I want to connect, because I want to accelerate this work, and because we don't have the time. We need to do this work urgently. And so the more urgently we do the work, the better chances we have.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you very much for your presentation. So I have a question about, so you mentioned in your presentation about sustainable finance for the project and how to gain the trust from the users and the government. So can you tell me more about like how you can maintain the sustainable finance for the project and how you gain the trust for different countries? Because like you mentioned, like Africa, like many countries. So how you gain the trust from the government and the people in each country? Thank you.
Okay. So this is very complex work that is at the macro to the micro level, and you need to be working in all those spaces. So for example, CIFOR-ICRAF, we have 25 offices around the world, and we've worked in over 90 countries. So those are networks, they're communities of practice, they're trusted partners in community, in government, in multilateral banks. So, you know, in value chains, so private sector. And so we harness those. We also work with hundreds of partners around the world. So that's our network. And then those partners have other partners. And so again, it's how do we accelerate communities of practice that work together? The other reality, particularly in the global South, is that there has been a huge focus on development aid funding, which is a space that's shrinking around the world. But we know that at best, development funding only represents 10% of the money available for climate, for example. So we need to go beyond the multilateral banks to look at the pension funds, to look at the big investment firms, and to have those dialogues. So for example, 2 years ago, I attended the largest annual event of the banking industry to talk to the bankers so they can start thinking about how do we partner. And so we started partnering with banks around, they're getting projects around climate and biodiversity, but they don't have the scientific technical expertise to understand how to evaluate them. So how do they know who are really great partners? And of course, I consider my organization one of them, but they need to know us. If they don't know us, they don't know who to go to. So again, the more we create these spaces where we get to meet across very different sectors, across people who are looking at social capital, natural capital, human capital, and productive, you know, profit commercial spaces, and we get everybody working together, the more we can accelerate how we can get the right financing on the table, investments. Thank you.
We got a question online. So one of the students is asking, so beyond the example of fire management, the tree growers, I think example, could you share an instance where indigenous knowledge was used successfully in combination or in conjunction with an AI project?
Okay, so if I look at our Regreening Africa program, so shea butter is a very critical industry in West Africa. And the shea pickers are women, okay? And the shea trees are wild trees. And so the combination of understanding what is social forestry policies in countries, what is the elevation of women's voices in terms of how they're working in the shea butter space, and how we integrate that in our Regreening Africa platform is a way that we can take the work we do and bring it to policymakers, bring it to banks, bring it to investors to look at how do we actually ensure that the women who are the caretakers of the shea trees are also supported in their livelihoods, not just in the stewardship and maintenance of the trees, but also in how they're working in the long term. So I had the opportunity about a year ago to be at a global food security summit where 72 ministers of agriculture were present. And the Minister of Agriculture of Nigeria came to me and he said, my mom was a shea grower and I went to school because of her. And he said, thank you for the work you do.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. We have another question from someone online. A question from Kim online. Overall, fragmented data collection is a common issue across most industries. Have you thought about how you plan to warehouse data across various efforts that is both standardized and decentralized?
That's a big one. So I have been having a number of conversations with people in the tech space, in the nonprofit, in government around how can we look at a global commons on land that allows access and with clear code of conduct and clear pay what you can pay to ensure accessibility. Because the problem we have today is, again, the big tech companies have access to the best data out there. But we have organizations like me that, mine, that are working at the grassroots level that are producing really amazing data. And so what we want is we want to make sure that every smallholder out there, that every indigenous and local community has access to equally high level data. And so this is where how we look at building data commons is a really, really important space. So we are the secretariat for the Global Landscape Forum, which is has 35 chartered members, and this is a convening in person and online that every year brings about 1 billion people to bring their voices to how we look at landscape health around the world. Every year in Africa, we usually have the Global Landscape Forum Africa, where we have young restoration champions that come to our campus in Nairobi, about 700 of them. We have about 7,000 people that join us online for that. We bring in artists and chefs to look at that interface of land health and cultural biodiversity that's linked to food and bring people together. And so one of the things that's really, really important is how do we create spaces for commons that really requires and allows equitable knowledge sharing and benefits. Benefits is a really, really important one.
Accessibility benefits. Thank you. Any questions in the room?
Thank you for the talk. When we're thinking about the scalability of things and just the overall energy use of AI sort of into the future as well, sort of where does that kind of fall within, sort of as you scale to 2030 and think about all of that, is that ahead of goal, or is that sort of just, will it sort of exponentially outpace one another? Yeah.
Okay, so this is the big, this is the elephant in the room every time. And so there are multiple dimensions to this. Okay. And remember, I'm not a domain expert, but what I'm going to tell you. So I was a champion for the Coalition for Digital Environmental Sustainability that looked at sustainabilization of the digital space and how digitalization could accelerate sustainability. So we all know that, we look at data centers and how do we locate data centers around the world in ways that minimize energy use. That's one place to do. We can look at, should we have decentralized data centers? Should we move everything to the cloud? So there's a lot of choices that have tensions around governance and energy use. So moving everything to a centralized cloud energetically would decrease costs immensely. But from a governance and sovereignty point of view, that's an issue we need to deal with. So it's not just about energy use. If we just wanted to say energy use, we'd have one cloud for everybody in the world, okay? But we really need to think about the tensions we hold. The other thing that we realize is the quality of the algorithms used is really important. So the more refined we get, less energy consuming algorithms. And so that's also really critical in terms of improving AI itself so that we get better results that have less energy consumption. So the complexity of the issue is an important one. And being in discussions with people in the tech world, in governments, in multilateral agencies, what I can tell you is the aim is, how do we outpace insights to the negative cost? So there are always trade-offs. And so it's really about how do we collectively work together to have more benefits. And ideally, as we're creating these benefits, that we're innovating for better energy use and ideally having a net zero energy system. So those are questions that are constantly on the table. And right now, the tendency is really about accelerating those insights, and the discourse around the energy use of AI needs to be put in comparison. There's data on how much energy you use to text, okay? How much energy you use if you're watching TV for 5 minutes. And so, it's also about looking at, relatively the comparisons and not looking at it in a siloed way. It's really looking at how are we looking at the system and how are we helping accelerate the system. And so for me, it's also about how are we de-risking investments in renewable energies. And so that's a whole policy issue that's critical around we're still investing in fossil fuel economies. How do we trade that to be doing accelerating investments in solar and in renewable energies that are nature positive and are ensuring that we're not increasing emissions. So this is a very complex problem that has governance and ethics issues, but it's one that everybody in the field is seriously looking at. And I think what is great right now is more and more the big tech companies are bringing transparency to their energy use and are also right now some of the biggest investors in terms of carbon sequestration around the world. So it's really about how do we get all those stakeholders to work together for AI for good that is the least energy consuming and accelerates what we can do collectively for the good of humanity and planet.
Maybe one last question. We have a question from a student online, and the question essentially, having had the privilege and the opportunity to work with a lot of indigenous communities, Africa and Canada, what do you think are some of the mechanisms to build trust around AI, or what are some of the things that unintentionally damage that trust with communities from the perspective of the community?
So I think one of the things to realize is the communities don't care about AI most of the time, okay? They're caring about fire. Okay? They're caring about the loss of their languages. They're caring about dignified lives, quality of water. And so what they usually want is they want to be able to frame their challenges and their opportunities. And then when we frame that, how can AI help unlock financing? So it's a stepwise process. So one of the things that's really important is AI isn't step one, it's like step 3.5. And when we try and make it step one, we're actually trying to force it down people's throats. And so this is where the work we do as people who are working in this space really requires that we listen. 2 years. We listen to communities, understand their challenges and opportunities, and then think about how then technology be used for good.
Definitely a major disconnect between tech enthusiasts and communities. I'm familiar with that. Thank you very much again for your time. Please let's thank Eliane for her time.